Today is all about sharing and learning, and a lot of the sessions will be about Engineers Without Borders team, as well as our colleagues and peers in the industry, about sharing our learnings from community development, collaboration with corporate and private sector, lessons in applied capacity building, and learnings from the field of appropriate technology. Before we go any further though, I would like to introduce Wurundjeri Elder Ron Jones to do an acknowledgement and welcome to country.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'd first like to start off by paying my respects to past and present elders and any elders that may be in the room, and all elders from any other nationality that might be here. My name is Ron Jones and I'm an elder of the Wurundjeri Council. The Wurundjeri people are traditional owners of a very large area. We go from the mouth of the Werribee River, we go right up to the Great Divide. Then from the Great Divide we go right up to the Yarra Ranges, then from the Yarra Ranges we come right back around to the Mordialloc Creek, then from the Mordialloc Creek we come right back around to the mouth of the Werribee River. Now my ancestors looked after this country for over 30,000 years, and we within the Wurundjeri, we care about our country, and of course we don't own the country owns us, so that's a way of Aboriginal life. It's that belonging to the country, and that gives us a sense of country. So within the Wurundjeri Council we work with Melbourne Ward, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of councils, a lot of developers, and our major expertise within the Wurundjeri Council is working with major growth urban authority and development around the growth urban boundaries and all that, and especially here within the Melbourne part here we have another two groups that's trying to claim our land, and so we have a lot of infighting about our boundaries. So when I talk about boundaries, I first met I think Lizzie Skinner. She came into our office in about 2007, and I met about 4 other engineers from Engineers Without Borders when they had their office in South Melbourne. So we've had a bit of connection with Engineers Without Borders, and I'll give a little bit of insight about my family history. The Wurundjeri is made up of 3 family groups. We are made up of the Wandans, Terricks and Nevins, but we all come from the Wandan group. And my mother, grandmother, great-grandmother and great-grandfather were all born on Corrandirk Aboriginal Mission Station up at Hearsville. And when I go home to Hearsville, I look at the cemetery up there sometimes. Corrandirk, to my mum and my grandmother and her brothers and sisters, thought what a lovely place it was, but when I sit back and look, it was a concentration camp to them people. And the discrimination that went on up there, because of my family group being 3/4 caste, I was segregated from the full bloods. So they kept one side to the other, and the half caste Aboriginals weren't allowed to learn their customs and weren't allowed to talk their language, so they had to, they were cut off from learning all that. But the people that were born up there, the quarter caste, and they suffered the most worst out of discrimination and everything up there, but they copped it on the cheek, and to them they didn't even know what discrimination was, or stuff like that back in them days. And so what happened, they sent a lot of full bloods down to Lake Tyers and Trandingham and them areas, and my mother and her family group and that was sent up to Barrett and Cumbergungeon in places. So that's what they did, but to get them off of Corrandirk, they promised them land up at around Barrett and all that, and when they got up there, about 2 years after, they were still waiting for their land, which was never ever given to them, so they all come back and resettled around Fitzroy, Melbourne, Preston, West Melbourne, Northcote, northern areas. So I've been very lucky, because when Whitlam came into power, my mum was actually working for the Advancement League back in them days, and only through Whitlam, we wouldn't have been counted in the census and the vote. That's the way I feel today. So only through that man that we had the first medical centre, legal service and everything, which started here in Gertrude Street, Fitzroy. That was back in the late 60s. And that's, from then on, it flowed right to the rest of Australia. A lot of people don't realise, only through Gertrude Street, Fitzroy, with the medical service, legal service and everything from here, I would have gone through Australia, but it was only through Whitlam coming into power that we achieved them things. But they talk about reconciliation, and when I look at reconciliation, that started back in 1937 when my father married my mum, and they made headlines. white man marries Aboriginal princess of the Yarra Yarra tribe, and that went right through Australia too. So to me, them white men that married Aboriginal women back in them days are very, very special men, because not too many European men or Anglo-Saxon men married Aboriginal women back in them days. So within my family group, my mother's brother-in-laws and that, they're all white men, and I'm very proud to say what fantastic men they were. So they were very special to us, and that was a part of reconciliation to me. Not like in the last 10 years they talk about reconciliation. In actual fact, reconciliation to me is ticking the box, and that's what a lot of people are doing. They're not really engaged, and they're not giving our people proper jobs and stuff like that. So I hope this is a chance for me talking today that a lot of your companies that just work for and that they'll start embracing Aboriginal people here within Victoria, and give them a chance to probably learn and to be educated into this type of field that these people are involved in. Because here in Victoria and Tasmania, we forgot about it. The government only focuses more on the Northern Territory, Queensland, Western Australia and places like that. Of course, we don't have any full-bloods here in Victoria, so we completely, I think, left out of the equation, because a lot of people don't realise our last full-blooded Aboriginal here in Victoria was a lady called Angelina McRae. She was born on Corranderk, and then when she was taken down to Lake Tyers, and that's where she died down there in 1986. So that was the last full-blooded Aboriginal Victorian woman that is gone, so we don't have any full-bloods here no more. So, and then when I think of my grandmother's brother, Uncle Joseph Wandon, he was born in the 1800s, and he was pulled out by the Protection Board at Corranderk to be the first Aboriginal school teacher. So we had an Aboriginal school teacher back in the late 1800s. A lot of, he's the only member, when he became a school teacher, he disowned his family history. Because back in them days, Aboriginal people weren't allowed to teach in school, so that's a bit of a shame. So all of his family, and the ones that are still living today, will not recognise of that blood, that they're of Aboriginal bloodline. And all of us within the Wurundjeri Council, we're all proud to say that we're Aboriginal people. And about 3 years ago, I was working out at the Maribyrnong River. So they were doing a pipeline there, and I was out there monitoring the job because it was so close to the site out there. And this young council worker from Brimbank Council, he came up and he took his sunglasses off and he was looking at me. And he said, "Are you the Aboriginal Mondo?" And I said, "Yes, I'm the outfit that wants the job." He said, "But you don't look Aboriginal." I said, "I don't, do I?" And he said, "No." I said, "You know the reason why?" He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I was born in the daytime and all my cousins are born in the night time." That goes to show you people are going to be very careful today, because they don't realise that they could be standing next to an Aboriginal person and they don't know it. So, you know, I get myself into a lot of trouble sometimes, especially when it comes up about Aboriginal people, and I say, "Wait a minute, do you know one?" "Oh, of course I know one." "I suppose you live next door to them?" "Yeah, of course we live next door to them." "Well, you're standing next to one here, so they soon walk off," you know. So a lot of our history and everything, I just love the culture, and when I go back, like I said, to the late 60s, only through Whitlam coming to power, I think we still would have been counted as fauna and flora. That's all we were. We weren't recognised as citizens in this country. So when the Constitution comes up in, say, another 2 years and they want to change it, hope all you people will vote for us to be recognised as the first people in this country. That's all we want to be, is recognised. But I think what the government will do, they're going to put in this bit about the treaty. It's like land rights. They put the fear of fright into people so they won't get it up in a referendum. But Aboriginal people, like I said, we don't want to, and you can't ever get any private land here in Australia. A lot of people, when you put in for traditional owner settlement, because no Aboriginal group within Victoria will ever get native title. That's the way the government set it up, so they can't prove it. So what they do, they give them traditional owner settlement. And it's only a very small amount of money that they get, and it's not going to take them groups into the near future, the next 100 years, so I don't see how they're going to survive. So that's, you know, when they put up for a referendum about the treaty, but people might think that we're going to come and take people's land. No, it's not about that, it's about us being recognised in the treaty. So women do big. I'd love to keep talking all day, but I've got to get back to the office. So have a great forum here, and thank engineers will be on board for having me here to give this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. every time I hear more and more stories from Aboriginal elders, I realise how much more I have to learn about the history and culture of Aboriginal communities in Australia. A little bit about the general housekeeping today. Just if you're looking for anyone that you need some help with, anyone with the orange lanyards should be able to help you out. If not, they'll point you to someone that can. Just in terms of emergency exits, the emergency evacuation point is around the corner on A. Beckett and Stewart Street. So just going out, there's several exits out of the building and it's sort of just around the corner there. Bathrooms are well signed. There's a set of bathrooms up near the lifts upstairs. In terms of the rooms today, some of the sessions are held in this room. There's also another session held on the floor, this same floor, and then there's another room on the floor where the registration is. So just look out for the EWB signs, and most of it should be on your schedule for today. There's also an appropriate technology display, and that's around on this floor in room 3. So you can, again, you'll see some signs for that, but there's a great display on there, so feel free to go and check it out in the break. We have the wonderful Lentil as Anything catering today, so they'll be doing some morning tea and lunch for us today. You'll know when to go because that will be the end of the session, but when the lunch break is over and you hear this bell, that's time to get moving back into the session. So just listen out for that and start moving. In terms of first aid, we do have first aid officers, so Alanta, if you can just pop your hand up, if there's anything that's needed there. So that's most of the little housekeeping stuff. So I'd now like to introduce you to our visionary leader and CEO, Lizzie Brown, and she will be facilitating the first session today.
Good morning everyone and welcome to our 2014 Engage Summit. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all with us here this morning. I'd like to start by thanking Uncle Ron for his welcome to country and also by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people as the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. So as Heidi mentioned, the purpose of today's event is to share our experiences and new opportunities for us to create positive change in the world through humanitarian engineering. And if you've had a look at the program, as I imagine you all have, you'll see there is a very strong focus on EWB case studies, but we're also very interested in bringing in the expertise of our partner organisations, collaborators and peers across the broader infrastructure and engineering sectors as well. So I hope you really enjoy the program that we've put together for you today. So this morning it's my pleasure to introduce our plenary session, and the focus is on infrastructure and industry linkages, with a particular emphasis on how we can maximise the social and community impact or benefits from the infrastructure development that we see here in Australia and across the Asia Pacific region. And there are a couple of reasons why we selected this particular topic. The first reason was really triggered by the recent announcement of the federal budget and the federal government's development priorities. But perhaps more importantly, we wanted a discussion that would really help provide context to the rest of today's program. As we're all aware, infrastructure and technology play an absolutely critical role, not only at the individual and the household level, but also in terms of the social and economic development of whole regions. And this occurs across water, sanitation, shelter, information communication technology, into areas including health, education, and more broadly livelihood and trade. So what we'd really love to do today is give you the opportunity to understand 3 quite different perspectives on infrastructure development. So I'm going to start with a keynote presentation from Marc Barrett from DFAT, and then we have Kirsten McDonald from ARC, as well as Marc Purcell from the Australian Council for International Development, to explore both the private sector and the international development sector's perspective on infrastructure development across the region. So what I'd love to do now is introduce you to Marc Barrett, who's a senior infrastructure specialist within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So Marc's actually a civil engineer by background, with over 25 years experience working in civil design and construction. He's been explaining to me, he worked originally with SMEC and then about 3.5, 4 years ago got involved working with AusAid and more recently with DFAT. He has a particular focus on supporting the implementation of transport infrastructure, and prior to joining DFAT was actually based in Papua New Guinea, where he was involved in supporting the implementation of road maintenance projects. So please join me in welcoming Marc.
Just grab some water. I've got half an hour's worth of talking, so I'm sure I'll need a few drinks along the way. Lizzie, thanks very much for that introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. I'm stuck in offices with bureaucrats and diplomats, and there's three engineers that work within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade on an ongoing basis. So I'm sure we've got a lot more than that here today. So it's great to be here. Just like to reflect, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade are, very, very happy to be working with Engineers Without Borders, and they help us implement our Australian NGO Cooperation Program, or the ANCP, which is a $134 million DFAT initiative that subsidises the development activities of Australian NGOs to directly and tangibly alleviate poverty in developing countries. Engineers Without Borders uniquely uses volunteers as a core tool to achieve development objectives. More broadly, EWB works to address the lack of access to clean water, sanitation, hygiene, energy-based infrastructure, waste systems, information communication technology and engineering education. I, and more broadly within DFAT, commend Engineers Without Borders for their continued commitment to development and this great approach to international development. Most of you would be aware that AusAid's merged into DFAT now, and the aid program is a new policy framework. I've got some copies of these which I've given to Lizzie, which are available for people to collect, but they're also available on the website. So there's this document, which is a small summary document, and there's other more detailed documents about how our aid program is going to go. So today I'd like to reflect on this new aid development policy and identify how this policy will influence social and community outcomes through infrastructure development. And I'll also touch on the funding and geographic priorities and provide some thoughts on what this means for Engineers Without Borders. So this particular slide, this picture was selected because I think it encompasses some of the really key development policy issues within this new Australian policy. The human development, the private sector development, and the aid for trade. So this is in Vanuatu, the Vanuatu Transport Sector Support Program, and it was a demonstration project to try and show that we can work with communities to develop private sector, to develop island-based contractors, to do work to maintain roads and to keep access open. So this particular section of road was on the island of Tanna, where there's vanilla plantations and the like. So once we get the communities up to speed with running these, or once the communities develop private sector organisations to implement these projects, they'll be able to maintain the roads and keep access open to these vanilla plantations and also other tourist opportunities. There's volcanoes and all sorts of activities that will hopefully be stimulated by better access. So more into just about the actual policy itself. So the policy sets out the purpose of the aid program, which is to promote Australia's national interest and to contribute to sustainable economic growth and poverty reduction. The aid program will do that through two outcomes, through the private sector development and the human development. So we're not completely focused on private sector and economic growth. At first glance you look at this and think that the human development side is where Engineers Without Borders can really fit in. But I think there's real opportunities within the private sector as well. Expanding opportunities for people, businesses and communities is key to both promoting economic growth and reducing poverty. People leave poverty when they get a job or a better paying job, and 9 out of 10 of these jobs are created in the private sector. Australian support will strengthen the private sector in our partner countries through improving business enabling environment and helping to create better functioning markets. But we also know that a focus on the private sector alone is not enough. Sustainable economic development and growth require a foundation of strong human development. To maximise social and community outcomes, we need to address community needs, not just focus on economic growth. Improving education, health, gender equality and women's empowerment are essential to both building a skilled and competitive workforce and lifting living standards. Our investments will support the poor to become participants in economic growth. And we'll work with effective partners, including NGOs, to expand our reach in the aid program. Australia remains firmly committed to assisting the most disadvantaged, including people with a disability. As can be seen by some of these projects, I think the BESIC program in Timor-Leste, engineers without borders have been involved in, and this is an example of some of the work there in that centre photo, with the accessible access to water and washing facilities. With other activities as well, mechanised ploughing to increase productivity and improving access to markets and create better social outcomes. So, on the ground, a key way that the program will maximise social and community outcomes is through the aid investment plan. So this is a new planning tool that all our country programs will have to implement. So over the next 12 months, all country and regional aid programs will develop this aid investment plan that identifies key development constraints based on economic, political and social analysis. Aid investment plans will outline how our investments will promote the private sector-led growth and enable the poor to participate and share in the effective benefits of greater economic growth. This will include considerations of ways to enable more disadvantaged members of society, such as people with disabilities, to access the same opportunities as others and improve their quality of life. We hope this way that the aid investment plan will have performance indicators and be designed to not only increase economic growth, but also really focus in on community outcomes and poverty reduction. So engaging with the private sector. Again, all new developments will look at ways to work with the private sector. As I've already mentioned, the private sector plays a critical role in reducing poverty. And this is true not only for economic growth and trade-related investments, but also for service delivery areas such as health and education. So, again, the picture that we've got here was taken in Tonga fairly recently. Tonga Transport Consolidation Project, it was called. It was to, in Tonga, the transport and maintenance sector was held pretty closely in the Department of Works. But they did a whole lot of other activities that weren't really core business for government. So this transport sector consolidation project tried to stimulate private sector investments, or private sector activity by outsourcing the maintenance work. So these are actually private contractors that are working there. So 3 years ago there were no civil contractors doing road maintenance work. Now there's 10 contractors bidding on work that the Department of Works is putting out. So I think this is a really good news story from Tonga. It's what I sort of have seen as real policy in action. The government has decided on a policy position and the way forward, and in 2 short years has really implemented that policy. And I think that's one of the best outcomes I've seen in the Pacific for many years. In fact, my first sojourn into development was 20 years ago in Tonga, and the junior engineer that I worked with then is now the chief engineer at the Department of Works. So it was fantastic to go back. It was 20 years almost to the day that I went back to Tonga. Saw these guys, I saw what they'd done. I mean, the first 18 years up to then, not too much happened, but in those last 2 years, a hell of a lot has happened. And I can't claim any benefit from that, but that was really great to see. A key platform of the new policy is Aid for Trade. Aid for Trade helps developing countries improve their capacity for trade, which drives economic growth and provides opportunity to build livelihoods. It's not about our trade, it's not about trade for the Australian government, it's about trade for the developing country that we're working in. So the Aid for Trade addresses key constraints to trade, including weak public institutions with poor capacity to formulate policy and implement policy actions. Poor infrastructure, including poor transport, communications and energy infrastructure. Insufficient private sector capability, including poor access to finance, supply chain and skilled workforce. The OECD estimates on average that every dollar invested in Aid for Trade increases recipient country exports by $8. Given this high return on Aid for Trade investments, the aid program will target increasing Aid for Trade to at least 20% of the annual spend of official development assistance by 2020. So to give some context to that, at the moment, in the 13-14 financial year, we're at about 12.5% of Aid for Trade. So it's almost a doubling in, by 2020. And also, for a bit more context, of the Aid for Trade spend, about 50% of that is infrastructure. So again, we'll be spending about double what we have done in the past on infrastructure. So while the aid program is plateauing at 5 billion, the infrastructure spend will actually be increasing. So this slide gives an overview of where the spend is and where the geographic focus is at the moment. As I said, at the moment, approximately $5 billion will be spent this and next financial year on ODA, and after that it will increase by CPI. We're also going to have a sharper geographic focus, with at least 90% of country programs will be directed to the Indo-Pacific region, particularly Southeast Asia and Pacific, our immediate neighbourhood. This geographic focus reflects the reality that the vast majority of our nearest neighbours are developing countries, and most of them face significant development challenges. I think, as probably everyone here will know, more than 700 million people still live in extreme poverty in Asia Pacific, surviving on less than $1.25 a day. And millions more barely above this extreme line. In Indonesia alone, there's more than 100 million people that live on less than $2 a day. The majority of our investments will be delivered by our country and regional programs, and just to give this geographic focus a bit more clarity, our Asian investments will be targeted in Indonesia, Cambodia, Vietnam, Philippines and Laos. And our Pacific investments will be targeted at PNG, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu and Samoa. That's not to say that we won't work in other Pacific nations, but it would be more likely to do that as a partner with the World Bank and ADB. So going forward with infrastructure. So our program will focus on priority areas that contribute to the achievement of our two development outcomes, the private sector development and the human development. We'll also have a strong Aid for Trade focus. Now, at the moment, our investment in infrastructure is fairly modest compared to other sectors. For example, at the moment, health has a spend of about 17%, as I said before, we're about 6% for infrastructure at the moment. Health is about 17% of ODA and education about 23%. So we're sort of catching up, if you like, to those other components of the aid program. In regards to actual programs, our infrastructure projects target soft and hard aspects of infrastructure. On the hard side, we provide capital investment for assets such as roads, bridges, railways, and these are generally accompanied by delivery assistance to ensure our investments demonstrate good practice and improve project quality. On the soft side, we provide assistance to improve policy, regulatory and institutional arrangements to improve project outcomes. Some examples of our recent projects in Indonesia, it's our only infrastructure loan, or our only loan, which is an infrastructure project, a loan for post-tsunami reconstruction for national roads. We're also assisting with the development of public-private partnerships and piloting output-based aid for services such as water supply and road maintenance. In Cambodia, we're developing a program to increase investment in electricity and water supply by encouraging small-scale private sector providers to extend their networks and reach out to poor households. In the Philippines, we're assisting governments to develop over $1 billion worth of PPP infrastructure projects. In the Asia Pacific region, telecommunications reform has been something we've worked on quite a lot recently, assisting Fiji, Indonesia, PNG, Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, Tonga and Vanuatu to regulate their competition and increase public sector participation and leave more water. So these photographs are some of the projects we're working on. The big bridge in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. I'm not sure if people have heard of the Catalan Bridge. Probably have, I guess. It's our biggest single infrastructure investment. We're co-financing with the ADB. Australia's providing about $160 million for that. Can't quite tell from that artist's impression, but the centre span there is 900 metres. So it's a fairly sizable bridge. We've just started construction. I've been to the site for the sod turning ceremonies and the like. So throughout this year, work will really get underway. Contractors are mobilised to site, and work is just about to start. But as well as concrete and steel and roads, WASH does also contribute to economic growth. Water and sanitation isn't considered a part of the Aid for Trade agenda. That's mostly to do with DAP codes and the like. So whilst it doesn't contribute to the Aid for Trade, it does contribute to economic growth. We're funding programs that support national governments to increase access to safe water and basic sanitation, improve hygiene and ensure sustainable service delivery. In 14-15, the budget for WASH programs is about $217 million. That's part of our health agenda rather than part of our infrastructure agenda. So in regards to enabling economic growth, our programs contribute to building infrastructure, building water and sanitation infrastructure, reducing time to access water and therefore increasing productivity, improving health and seeking opportunities to include the private sector. So what's all this mean for Engineers Without Borders? The aid program will continue to deliver through a variety of partners, including NGOs. The Australian NGO Cooperation Program, as I think I mentioned earlier, has increased to $134 million a year, which is an increase of $3.3 million this financial year. The ANCP has been a source of funding for Engineers Without Borders, but I think these recent policy changes that I've spoken about also bring other opportunities to NGOs and EWB as well. Two areas I think really need to be considered is engagement with DFAT country programs and linkages with private sector. As I've spoken about, the private sector is a key focus for the aid program going forward. But how does the DFAT country program engage with the private sector? I think there's still lots of question marks about that. I think certainly one option would be to partner with individuals or groups that have good country experience. I know Engineers Without Borders do have those sorts of experience, particularly in Cambodia and the like. If they can bring that expertise to the country program, I think there are real opportunities to going forward. As an example, DFAT is developing are designed for private sector development in the water supply sector in Cambodia. So partnering with these knowledgeable partners is a great way. You know, this middleman, someone that's trusted, that can work between the private sector in country and DFAT in country as well. Engineers Without Borders has these skills. I think they could really look at pursuing a private sector engagement agenda that aligns with the new aid policy. These sorts of things will take time, as with any change in the aid program. They won't happen overnight. They certainly are happening now, and it's worth developing those relationships now, particularly as these aid investment plans are being developed over the next 12 months. I think it would be worthwhile reaching out to our country programs and making yourself very well known to them. Also, some specific sort of opportunities. I think a lot of these things have been done already by Engineers Without Borders, water and sanitation, vocational training, capacity building. But one area that I do see as a growth opportunity is the road safety area. Something that's an emerging area, I guess, but even though it's been around for so long now, it's a bit difficult to sort of call it an emerging area. You know, over 1.2 million people die every year from road accidents. And while in developed countries we're reducing our road toll, they're certainly increasing in developing countries. Developing countries have less than 50% of the world's cars, but account for 90% of the deaths and injuries. So it's an area that really requires, I think, a lot more attention, and hopefully will do in the new SDG process that's going on at the moment. As the new Sustainable Development Goals are being developed, at the moment there's still a target in there for road safety. I think if road safety gets that imprimatur given by the SDGs, that would be a fantastic thing, and it would certainly be an opportunity for NGOs to work in. Okay, thank you. Just put a few photos from my slides. I love this photo with the elephants in the road there. I think it really sort of shows what development's like. I mean, it is a slow slog, but you've just got to keep persevering. I think, you know, when I saw these elephants walking down the newly graded road, it sort of resonated with me. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Marc, for providing us with an introduction to the Australian Government's priorities and approach to international aid and development. We're going to hear more from Marc shortly, but what I'd like to do now is introduce you all to Kirsten McDonald from ARP. Kirsten leads up ARP's Australasian involvement in international aid and development, but her focus is also domestic as well. So Kirsten has a lot of experience working with Aboriginal communities and is the Indigenous market sector lead for ARP. Now, her background's both in design and in international development, and she's now very much a specialist in engaging communities and organisations in participatory approaches, not only to the design of projects, but also, importantly, to their implementation as well. So we have the opportunity now to hear briefly from Kirsten, who's going to talk a little bit more about the private sector perspective before we open the panel discussion with Marc Purcell. Thank you, Kirsten.
I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I started my professional journey at RMIT, so it's a great pleasure for me to be back here. I started out in the Faculty of the Built Environment, and I'm not an engineer. I studied interior architecture. My focus, I guess my passion, was to design human-scale spaces that facilitated human activity. So what we needed to do in the environments in which we spend most of our time. So my career's really transitioned from that start, really designing and delivering spaces, or designing buildings from the inside out, I like to consider it, to now designing processes that engage all stakeholders in what we like to think are meaningful ways, and engaging them in the design of their own built environments. This image on the screen is one that sort of typifies the types of images that we see all the time in our profession. This is an image of Jakarta. I'm spending quite a lot of time in Indonesia at the moment, so you'll see a lot of Indonesian images throughout this presentation. And it's the type of, as I said, type of image we see a lot. Infrastructure, buildings and cities from sort of bird's eye perspective, devoid of people. Yet, and it's always fascinated me the way we look at our built environment, and that we do often, particularly as professionals, we don't acknowledge, and we certainly don't capture in our imagery, our photographs. I mean, Barrett is guilty of this as well. The fact that people populate our built environments, and you know, we see that people are the ones that experience all the challenges that we set them up to experience through the way in which we approach the design of spaces. Lizzie asked me to talk about some of the key challenges and the opportunities, and for Arup, and certainly from our perspective as design professionals, we see our key challenge is the increasing frequency and severity of natural man-made disasters, and the impact that these have on the ability of our built environments to meet the needs of those that they serve, and that's us. And it's this is a good example. This is a city in Vietnam, the only non-Indonesian image, where we've been doing some work, and you can see, you know, the types of situations that we're facing in our built environments because of this increasing uncertainty that we are facing. And that situation is challenging everything about our practice, not only as individuals. I know myself it's very challenging for my practice, but as an organisation, from Arup's perspective, but also in our work, I mean, certainly Arup's work globally, shaping a better world. And this challenge is one of building resilient environments is also what we think is our greatest opportunity as professionals. And certainly those that like to think of ourselves as consultants to the built environment. This is a definition of how we see resilience at Arup. So we look at resilience through the lens of institutions, infrastructure and knowledge networks, and how they can adapt so that urban populations can survive and thrive. So it's not static, it's how we change as a result of our experiences through our experience of shocks and stresses that we face. So at Arup, and certainly our international development team, gosh, that's, I don't know if it's all right on screen. Oh, sorry, I thought that the circle on the framework on the right there it's QF, but we are working on a number of initiatives ranging from a global scale. So this is a project we're working on called the City Resilience Index, which is global, but our international development team is leading that. We are working at a regional level. We are a regional partner in the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, which is a US $60 million investment by the Rockefeller Foundation in 4 countries in this region. And we are also working at a local level, right at the coalface, with cities, most closely in Indonesia, but in India as well, where city governments are taking action to build resilience or reduce vulnerability of their urban poor communities. So what does all this mean for us as professionals? In the first instance, it means we have to, and certainly from our perspective at Barrett, we have to shift our focus from building environments to building people. And for that, for us, that means from shifting our focus from outputs to outcomes. You've all heard that terminology before. I think as built environment professionals, we're very good at delivering the building, the bit of road, the bridge, but it's never just that. The building is there to serve a purpose, the purpose to host this event today, the purpose for people to live, work and play. The road connects and provides a vehicle for economic development. So we need to shift our focus. We need to adopt a systems approach to our work that acknowledges our built environments are very complex. They're made up not only of infrastructure, institutions and knowledge networks, but that in order to design truly resilient environments that respond to shocks and stresses, we may need to also engage, as built environment professionals, engage with institutions and knowledge networks. So it's not just about us focusing on infrastructure. In order to design resilient environments, we also need to understand institutions and knowledge networks, which means we have to work in a multi-sectoral way. So we not only need to work in a multi-sectoral way, we also need to change the way we work at every stage of the project life cycle, from idea through to implementation and then post-occupancy or post-handover. So we really need to think very differently. Now, all of these images are actually from projects that we're working on. This one particularly, we have developed a capacity building program associated with the Agency's Climate Change Resilience Network, which looks at how we need to redesign. It's about building capacity of teams that are having to work differently in this multi-sectoral way, and how they can design and deliver projects that also deliver resilience as an outcome. We also need to learn to reflect deeply on our practice and in order to be more readily able to adapt to this increasingly uncertain future. This is an image of some exercises as part of this capacity building program that we're delivering, where we're asking organisations, individuals and organisations to think very deeply about how their experience of working on projects that seek to build resilience or reduce vulnerability of urban poor communities, how that has changed them and what that means for their practice going forward. So transformative change comes from an ability to reflect deeply, and so these are some of the different types of ways in which we're needing to work as built environment professionals to achieve these outcomes. I think that's probably pretty much it. But you know, I think there is great opportunity, as I said, for us to rethink and reframe the way in which we work as professionals in order to deliver social outcomes into the future. So thank you.
Kirsten, thank you very much for sharing some of your insights with us, particularly in terms of how we can improve community resilience in the built environment. I have to admit, many of your words rang true. I was catching a flight to Sydney the other day and looking through the Virgin In-Flight magazine, and there was a double-page advertisement promoting or celebrating the awardees or the projects that had been awarded through the Construction Industry Awards. And I looked at the double-page spread and I felt something was wrong and I couldn't quite work out what it was. And then I realised of all of the 20-odd projects, they were all large-scale infrastructure projects, and there wasn't a single person in any of them. And I just thought how much of a missed opportunity that is for us to share with the Australian community and more broadly the valuable contribution that work actually makes to healthcare, to education, to employment and so on. What I'd now love to do is introduce you to Marc Purcell, who's the Executive Director of the Australian Council for International Development, or ACFID. Now, ACFID is the peak body for the Australian international development and community development sector, and it actually represents over 100 different member organisations, of which Engineers Without Borders is one. So Marc, please join us in sharing your perspectives on infrastructure development across our region. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Vicky. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today and their elders, past and present. I want to just give a quick overview of the development trends in the century we're living in and the coming decades in which you'll have your professional lives. Then I want to make a few quick comments about the focus in private sector development and safeguards. So, we're living in an extraordinary period in human history in very dramatic changes in human development. You might be aware of the Millennium Development Goals, the 10 goals set by the UN 15 years ago, but the first overarching goal is to halve the level of human poverty by 2015. And while there is still substantial progress to be made in particular thematic goals on reducing maternal mortality rates and so on, the actual halving of global poverty will be achieved. And in fact, the UN is reporting that it has been achieved already in many instances. So for example, in East Asia and the Pacific, the focus of the Australian Aid program, about 14% of the population live on $1.25 per day, which is down from 77% of the population in the Asia Pacific region in 1981. So dramatic reductions in human poverty, still massive amount of work to be done, but this is a very significant achievement. And it's come about because of a shift in economic development around the planet and correspondingly a shift in where human poverty is concentrated on the planet. Back in 1990, 93% of the world's poorest people lived in low-income countries. And so you're very familiar probably with the images of starving people in Africa, in famine and so on, and that's the popular image still in many cases of poverty. But actually now, in 2014, 3/4 of the world's poorest people live in what the World Bank broadly terms middle-income countries. So these are countries that have a per capita income of about $3,500 and above. So it's more than $1.25 a day, yeah? And there's still concentrated poverty in about 39, 40 very least developed countries, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. But what this means, this shift of human poverty into these middle income countries, is that there's more potential for governments in those own countries to actually develop policy frameworks and direct resources to lift people out of poverty because they have a greater capacity, they've got more economic growth. Over time, we would expect to see development trends occurring as we have seen in southern and eastern China, where people are coming out of poverty. Secondly, we're seeing massive rises in inequality as the wealthy become extremely wealthy, and there is still many, many millions of people living in extreme poverty in those countries. So the contrasts are much, much starker. And this is a bit of a challenge for conventional development, which has gone on a transactional model, which is take resources from aid programs or NGOs and send them to the poorest in developing countries, and that will alleviate poverty. Because actually what we're seeing is increasing capacity of southern governments, developing country governments, to actually tackle development problems themselves. Secondly, we're seeing an increased desire of southern developing country governments to deal with each other. So South-South cooperation has been talked about more. So Vietnam, for example, is saying, well, we are developing, we're actually a middle income country now, and what can we share with Malawi in terms of our experience? And for the Malawian government, that's a very attractive proposition because the Vietnamese are saying, well, we understand what you've been through because we've just been through that and we're still going through that transition. We understand your experience in a way that people in Australia perhaps can't understand. Yeah? The other big trends, this shift will continue to accelerate. And so China is now the second largest economy in the world. It means that by the time, it's still 35% of the American economy in terms of size. It's about 35% less. But by the time the Chinese and Indian economies get per capita incomes at the similar level of Australia, later this century, their economies will be 4 times larger than America and European Union combined. So what this means in terms of human history is that over the last 250 years, the world's wealth has been concentrated in about 15% of the human population and 85% very poor, and now we're seeing a broadening out of wealth across the world. So this is the century you live in, this is the century that you bring your skills to bear. What does that mean in terms of what you might do? Well, there's significant challenges, as we know, still in tackling inequality, but also on constraint on resources. The UN Environmental Programme consider that 60% of the world's ecosystems are badly degraded. So we know that there's increasing pressures on the environment, the sustainable environment, and the built environment within that has an enormous effect. So how do we actually conserve human resources, replenish them, and preserve them for future generations? So that's something you need to factor in. Carbon emissions. It's not sufficient to build a road or a dam, hard infrastructure like those big bridges, without taking into account the carbon emissions generated. So costing the environmental impacts of infrastructure and development is increasingly important. When I think, or when ACFID talks about the private sector, we recognise that there may be some opportunities for some Australian companies in the new government focus on the private sector. But for us, the real focus of the private sector should be within developing countries, and I think Marc acknowledged that in his speech. And the reasons for that is that in low-income countries, most of the poorest people are employed in the private sector, but they're smallholder farmers, they're small shop owners, they're small-scale manufacturers. And in fact, this accounts for about 70% of the employment in low-income countries and 60% of GDP. And so there's enormous opportunities to work with the private sector in developing countries. They have significant constraints. They have a lack of access to capital, insurance, and probably the biggest capacity constraint in developing countries is what you might call social infrastructure. It is poor education systems, poor health systems, and weak systems of governance. So if you're going into Timor, for example, they actually have a lot of income coming on stream now from the oil fields. They're not short of cash, but if you went into work in the Department of Public Works, for example, you would find people who are in government positions but are illiterate and innumerate. So how do you, as people that specialise in infrastructure, work in that environment where capacity is very, very low? And this is where the focus of Australia's aid program, I believe, still needs to be in education and skill sharing and sharing knowledge. So it's actually in the soft infrastructure where we can make the most sustainable gains over the coming decades, because that's where the real need is. Developing country governments have many sources of finance these days. They can borrow money from all sorts of sources. They're not particularly reliant on aid. So from my point of view, that bridge in Vietnam, while it looks good and it's a good diplomatic thing to do, it's not the best investment. It's much more in the technical know-how, the knowledge. So how would you build infrastructure such as roads or water and sanitation, sewerage systems that basically are 21st century models of what sustainable infrastructure development would look like, that take into account carbon emissions, etc. There's lots that you can offer in exchanging this knowledge and sharing your skills and experience with developing country government officials, private sector and not-for-profits, and that's what EWB, I believe, is about. If you're going to be investing in hard infrastructure, the Australian government and multilateral donors have a lot of experience in doing this now, built up over decades, and generally that experience about what is good practice is captured in what is known as safeguards. And you can look on the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade website to see what their safeguards criteria are, but basically they are social and environmental safeguards. When you go into a place like Cambodia or Papua New Guinea, there is no private land titles in general. In Cambodia, because of the Khmer Rouge, in PNG, because land is communally held through Wontoks. So if you're building a road, actually it's going through communally held land. And the issues of who gets benefits, who gets benefit and who gets compensated when infrastructure is built is actually a very live one. And if safeguards aren't appropriately followed, in terms of community consultation, looking at the social and environmental impacts, compensation, it can go pear-shaped very quickly. So Toll Holdings, for example, an Australian company working in Cambodia on rehabilitation of the Cambodia railway line, withdrew from the project because about 4,000 people were disproportionately affected by the inadequate application of safeguards by the partner, the Cambodian government. Yeah, so there are lessons to be learned here if you're going to be doing hard infrastructure. But for my money, I think the best use of the official aid program and for your energy is actually in that skills and knowledge transfer and working very patiently with developing country partners in local government, in private sector, in non-government organisations, in sharing your experience and your knowledge and investing in the training up and skilling up of people from quite a low base over time. And I think that will bring great benefits over time, and that's where the role in that soft knowledge sharing is going to be the most important aspect of development assistance in coming decades. Thank you.
Marc, thank you very much for drawing our attention back to the importance of knowledge sharing and capacity building in community development and poverty alleviation. As a number of our presenters this morning have mentioned, that really is the crux of Engineers Without Borders approach to supporting poverty alleviation. And we do that primarily through the placement of skilled professionals within our partner organisations so that they can build that institution or organisation's technical capability over a long period of time. And I very much hope that the conversation that Marc started with us now around safeguards will continue throughout the rest of today, but also a conversation around social infrastructure and what our role is as an engineering profession in building social infrastructure, not just here in Australia, but across the region as well. So we now have the opportunity to spend some time in discussion with our panel members. I've got lots of questions, but before I dive in, I'd love to provide you with the opportunity to ask questions of our panel here today. And I would request if you could please stand up and introduce yourself before posing the question. That would be much appreciated. So is anybody keen to go first? Jai, hello.
Hi there, my name is Jai Allison. I work for the Blue Mountain City Council and Bushfire Recovery Program. I have a question to Marc. I just wanted to... Oh, sorry, I'm right. I just wanted to try and delve into that issue around the way that economic development has lifted a lot of people out of poverty, but at the same time increased the inequality. I suppose for me, doesn't that sort of ring alarm bells that maybe that's not purely the best way to go?
Yeah, absolutely. What governments in developing countries have a increased potential to do now is start providing more social protection. So the types of social protections that have emerged over the past 140 years, 150 years in Australia and other developed countries. So basic living wages, universal basic health care, free public education, pensions for old age or people with living with disabilities. These types of social protections are now starting to be rolled out in some middle income countries like Indonesia and Brazil, and they're very important measures, social measures, to actually mitigate
the depth and extent of absolute poverty as incomes rise in some parts of the population. And the Australian government and other donors sort of work a lot at a government level and actually putting in the policy frameworks for some of these areas. But it does take political will, and sometimes it's just in places like Timor or Papua New Guinea, the education system is so dysfunctional at a central level that it's actually hard to get traction with some of these policy frameworks.
Kim, I work for New South Wales, apologise for not having a voice. Question for probably both Marcs. Marc, you mentioned the toll pulling out in Cambodia. I guess saying that toll pulled out because the Cambodian government didn't safeguard its people is one way of looking at it, but also that I think it was a responsibility for a company working in that operating environment to have those safeguards themselves. We talk about building capacity of developing country governance and governance bodies. Do you think there's a role there and how could we ensure that Australian companies that are working in these environments also, how do we build capacity of our own companies that are working in these environments so that these things don't always fall to the recipient governments? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll start off there. Toll holdings have the concession to run the railway line, not do the rehabilitation work that required the resettlement activities. So Toll weren't really responsible for any of the resettlement. It was a Government of Cambodia problem, who should have been supported by other consultants and by the ADB and to some extent by AusAid at the time. The way AusAid was co-financing a small proportion of the whole loan. I think it was $20 million out of 140 million from memory. And the expectation when AusAid got involved was that ADB would run the show. They had most of the skin in the game and have the safeguard policies that the Government of Cambodia was supposed to work to. Unfortunately, that never happened. We all know that the ADB has been dragged over the coals over that particular project. So we've got to frame that a little bit right. Toll weren't responsible for the resettlement activities that didn't go according to plan. But yeah, there certainly is a role to make sure that our private sector do know how to act and respond. And I think in our bilateral programs, that's much clearer.
Could I just say that two things. So one is that for Australian-based companies working in infrastructure, certainly if they were working in remote regional Australia and they're working in any way with Indigenous communities, but also around cities, the level of due diligence you have to do now and good practice around environmental assessments, social assessments, it's part of normal business operations, and that type of approach needs to occur when you're operating in developing countries. It's not sufficient to say, oh, we'll just follow the laws or practice in that jurisdiction, which is sometimes can be a corporate response. You have to take the practice you have here out into the world. The second point is Chinese state-owned enterprises and banks have all the runs on the board in building that sort of hard infrastructure, I believe, like roads and bridges these days, in terms of the ability to undercut, in terms of price, an Australian company. However, my view is that exactly because DFAT have safeguards, if they're putting official development assistance into it, the ADB have safeguards that are being slowly lifted by NGOs scrutinising what they do. It's actually an area where we have a lot to offer in high quality, best practice infrastructure and development, if you're talking about the hard stuff. And in terms of the technical advice and social and environmental impact assessment, Australian companies and the Australian government through its aid program should be in this space, but perhaps more in that advisory, technical, social and environmental impact assessment and design. I think we have a lot to offer. I don't know how that plays out in practice, whether it's possible, but we shouldn't be lowering the bar globally. We should be raising it.
I'd like to add to that because Arabi is a private company and we are an independent organisation, so we're a little bit different from some of our competitors. But notwithstanding, we do operate on a commercial basis. Our international development group, on the other hand, doesn't. We operate on a not-for-profit basis, but the group globally is a private sector entity. We have been, I think Marc raised a few really good points. I mean, we work in both remote, regional and coastal Australia with Indigenous communities. We also work throughout the developing world. We have obviously we're values. Arab has very strongly held values, so most of our people adhere to those values. But also we have to work in accordance with the contract agreements that we have with our clients, which typically set out the way in which we have to work. So I do think that most companies are acting in the best interest. But I should also say it's actually really, really hard, this work. And if you're going to be doing it, so really engaging with stakeholders in these contexts, it's not easy, and we do have to work in a very different way in which we would normally work here, for example. Now, I would argue that we should be working in the same way across all groups, but we do find, I see high levels of burnout because it is hard. I mean, even just, I think you mentioned it, Marc, in your presentation, just we need to, communicating complex technical concepts to people who are non-technically literate is extremely difficult for technically trained people. Very, very, very difficult. I see it every day. Plain language is the term I say most often in the office. I don't understand it and I'm a technically trained person. So how is someone who's non-technically literate supposed to understand the decision that you're asking them to make? So I think that it's very important on us, it's incumbent on us actually as professionals to really think differently about the way in which we practice, because it's not that it's every day the way in which we communicate, I think, that makes the difference on top of all of the adherence with social safeguards, etc., etc.
Before we take another question, I'd love to ask each of our panel members to comment on some of the opportunities you see or perhaps that are already in place for sharing best practice, whether that's in the private or the public sector. Or perhaps maybe there's a gap there. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Best practice is a funny term. Appropriate practices, appropriate technologies and so on. I think that we need to be quite careful. Now, I notice there's some appropriate technologies, workshops and things later down the track. And I think that's what we need to be very careful of, that we're not just transporting what we do in Australia and trying to do that internationally. It doesn't always work. That's not trying to pass the buck by saying that we shouldn't provide best practice for the social and environmental safeguards. And as far as environmental safeguards go, Australian companies are bound to Australian legislation to apply that internationally as well. So we're quite tightly controlled, I guess.
Kirsten, did you want to comment?
A lot of the work that we're doing at the moment through our international development group is probably, and I don't want to sound arrogant in any way, but it's really at the pointy end. It's not been done before, and actually we're not leading it. This is work being led in countries by cities that are trying to address their vulnerabilities to various climate-induced and natural disasters. And as part of that, it's extraordinarily important that we reflect deeply on what we're learning and that we exchange knowledge. And to that end, we have we have a key role in the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network with the Rockefeller Foundation and the other partners to develop a knowledge management strategy and implement that across the network. Now, and that had multiple sort of prongs to it. So, and the purpose of that was to enable these cities that were doing something that never ever been done in the way it was being done, to capture, document and then disseminate not only within their own countries but regionally, of course, and then we have language difficulties, and then globally, what they were learning, what was working, what wasn't working, what they would do differently next time in a way that was usable for others who were embarking on a similar journey. And again, no simple task, but extraordinarily important. So there are lots of different examples, and I'd agree with Marc too on the issue of best practice. We don't use it. Good practice, appropriate practice is I think is more meaningful.
Last December I was up in Timor, in provinces outside of Dili called Linkages, and I was visiting some work done by an NGO called Water Aid. It was in water and sanitation, and basically the communities that were benefiting from this sort of simple water supply and sanitation program were living up a very, very steep hill. Timor, if you've been there, is incredibly mountainous. And the nearest spring was about 2.5 kilometres away. So what that meant was that to get potable water, aside from rainfall, the women used to walk 2.5 hours every day and gather it in buckets and carry it back for cooking and washing, etc. And so what Water Aid did was develop essentially user groups within the community, within the villages, that were responsible for building but also maintaining the water supply. So the water supply was very simple. It was just polypiping coming down the mountainside from the spring, but running off into people's allotments essentially as you went down the mountain. And what it enabled people to do was grow produce more effectively because there was a constant water supply, and then they were able to sell that produce down in the nearest market town and improve their livelihoods because they were getting more of an income. And coupled with that, there was a hygiene program in the schools, which was teaching kids and their parents about basic hygiene, because people aren't trained or aware necessarily of germs and contamination through bacteria. So in that context, that program was really good practice and very effective and sustainable. The NGO brought in really the materials, did the training, but it was the theory behind it is it's sustaining because the community understand the basic principles that they need to maintain the water supply over time and repair it. It doesn't mean that problems don't occur, problems can. That type of model though won't work in Dili, where you're getting rapid urbanisation, and the images that we saw before of the slums. I mean, 70% of the world's population will live in urban settings by 2050. It's already more than half the planet. And so that type of sort of community sustained water supply is not going to operate effectively in an urban setting. You do need a Department of Public Works there, and that's where I believe the official aid program has a really important role to play in both investing in education so people are literate and numerate and can go into the public service with basic skills, and then in technical know-how about how to do this. And I think there's good practice in those areas as well that the Australian Aid program has developed over the years working with partner governments.
Can I just say, just one thing I'd like to add is there's great practices happening on the ground that we also need to learn from as practitioners. And actually I think there's lessons that I've learned recently through some work in Indonesia, which I think are relevant here and we need to be learning from here. But there's, I think the thing about the urban setting and sort of informal settlements and relying on governments to deliver services it's just so difficult in the developing context. And so what you get is you get communities that do need interim measures in order that they can withstand the shocks and stresses that they face, And they may, but they shouldn't be in replacing government investment, but in many cases they have to do that because there's not the government investment there to deal with the issues that they have to confront.
And I'll just add a little bit more too about the private sector in the opportunities for water supply and electricity supply as well. In Cambodia, for instance, there's lots of small entrepreneurs that provide water and electricity to smaller communities. So as well as the public sector, there's opportunities for the private sector to do that too. And that's something that the aid program is looking at, about how we can maximise that. I mentioned it during my speech as well about that work in Cambodia. So it'll be very interesting to see how that goes.
So just to keep the discussion going, but the challenge with where very poor people live in cities is they're living in often slum conditions or slum-like conditions, and they're often squatting. They don't own the land. So the question of putting public infrastructure, whether it's privately funded or publicly funded, doesn't arise because nobody's going to deliver services to people that are there illegally. And they might have been there illegally for a couple of decades, and the settlement just grows. And then because it's identified that there needs to be sort of a larger infrastructure road or something coming in, it might go right through the middle of that slum, and so there'll be massive displacement. And from the government's perspective, well, they're illegal, so we're not going to compensate them because they shouldn't be there in the first place, even though they might have been several generations of people living in that area. So the complexities in a developing context are very real, and the context is everything, and you have to be very adaptive in the solutions you find you're going to apply, because the solutions that you can have a series of principles and safeguards, but the solutions are going to be tailored to the context. They're not going to be things that would apply in Australia.
We'll keep the conversation going. But that said as well, if the government borrows money from the ADB or the World Bank, the onus is on them to apply the safeguard policies that the banks have. Yeah.
What I thought was really interesting about your first responses was that, Marc, you looked at the safeguarding process and application of policy and legislation, and Kirsten, you talked to cross-organisational knowledge sharing, and then Marc, you looked at the community scale. And I don't know if that was deliberate on your part. That was a beautiful set of examples at different scales using quite different mechanisms. So, Ian, I think I saw your hand up earlier. Were you?
Yeah.
You can.
Ian Cunningham, so I was former program coordinator at EWP, now working on a few special projects. So, question for Marc, Barrett, you just started alluding to it then. I'm just interested in some of the challenges on the scale of the federal aid program, how it filters down to some of that private enterprise at that small scale. So Marc Purcell spoke about 77% private enterprise being those small holders, about some of the challenges of a larger aid program actually meeting those dispersed needs. Perhaps a few analogies of some projects that you might be aware of could be useful.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that the program's struggling with now, developing these aid investment plans which will target these areas. The aid program is very decentralised, so that's being developed in country. So it's difficult to say. I mean, I think the easiest analogy is that one in Cambodia again, where the program is still being developed. The design has gone through its first draft, but the idea is to target these entrepreneurs that have already have a electrical distribution or a water distribution network, and how we can then stimulate them to grow. There are similar things in Indonesia, the water healer, even though that's not through the private sector, that's through the public sector, with an output-based aid approach to try and stimulate expansion to the networks. And I think that output-based approach will be the way that it'll need to go with the private sector as well, to try and get the output first. We can pay for it, and we'll achieve the outcomes that we want to, hopefully, after that. The access to basic financial services
is a major problem for very poor people. If they're smallholder farmers or they're small traders. Basically, in lots of places there's no banking system, and even if there is a bank at a provincial level, it won't lend to the very poor because they don't have collateral as such. They might be living on community held land, they won't have land title in places like Cambodia or Papua New Guinea. So the types of interventions you want to make then are sort of around financial inclusion. So it is micro banking. There's interesting examples of people being able to bank in Africa and Kenya through Barclays Bank and a local bank and a mobile phone provider called, I've forgotten their name, but basically people can bank on their mobile phone because mobile phone technology is prevalent, the banking services are not, but they can use this system. And CARE, the NGO involved, does financial training. That type of service actually enables businesses to grow because if you can't save your money anywhere, except, sort of under the bed, you can't accumulate interest and things like that as well. It's hard to get loans. So if you don't have a track record with a financial institution. So these type of systems can work. But I come back to my earlier point that the World Bank does a doing business survey in developing countries, and the number one issue that the private sector say that dominates for them is the lack of a skilled and trained workforce, which comes back to your basic education system and before that your health systems. So I think the Australian Aid Program can intervene at a whole range of levels of education because it is doing primary education, it's doing secondary education, but we can be doing a lot more, and we do good work in vocational education in the Pacific, for example, through support for a regional training college. And so in the technical skills, that whole different levels of tiers of education is where sustainable development will come in the long term, or the medium to long term, in my view.
I'd just like to give an example of a project that we looked at recently in Indonesia, and I think it's very interesting because it ties together how a community responded to a challenge of poor infrastructure, so a failure in an existing urban system, the stormwater drainage system, and how that turned into an economic development opportunity. I think it's important because and I spoke about this earlier, I think as professionals we need to start to see our built environments and the role that we play in designing and delivering those as one part of a much bigger puzzle, and we need to understand the other bits of the puzzle in order to have deliver a successful, satisfactory outcome. This particular project was very interesting. So it's a village in a city, a second-tier city in Indonesia, so a city of around about 1 million people. This village was sort of a unique village. It was multicultural, so there was, as it was pointed out to us, there was a mosque, there was a temple, there was a church in the community. So it was very unusual for a village in this particular city. The village experienced flooding, regular flooding as a result of waste, poor waste, a failure in the solid waste management system and a failure in the stormwater drainage system. So the waste would block up the stormwater drains, there would then be flooding within the village. So the villagers got together, they decided they needed to deal with these two failures. They started they call it a waste bank. Well, they actually started just collecting the rubbish around, removing it from the drains. They saw an opportunity to separate that rubbish, recycle it, rather than give it to the informal, put it into the informal waste management system. They started to collect and separate their own waste. They would sell that waste on. The community then, they would get small amounts of money, and I'm talking tiny amounts of money, but it was centralised. The community collected the money. They call it the waste bank now because the villagers decided not to take their money out of the money that was owed to their household for the waste that they'd contributed into the system. And so they now have a small investment fund that they're now using to finance microloans. This was all out of a community acting to address a failure in systems that we are part of designing here, all these people here, and how that then led to, it did a number of things. I mean, the community's more resilient, they don't experience flooding anymore. They've got there's a whole lot of social outcomes, but there's also a financial outcome, and it will just continue to grow because it's got high buy-in. Now that attracts other donors, because that initiative is now going to receive other funding so that they can expand, scale up and replicate and share that initiative. So it's just an example of how infrastructure is not separate to the other systems within which we operate in the context of our densely populated cities.
Mel, I think you had a question.
I think. I'm Mel Bock, I'm former EWB volunteer as well. I have a question for Marc Barrett. Just around, I guess you framed your discussion around providing economic growth opportunities for the context in which Australian aid is going to go into. And this follows on a little bit from Jai's question as well. How is doing things with a particular focus on economic growth and what I guess many people would term a neoliberal sort of economic approach to aid going to make sure that there isn't a widening gap of inequality and that there isn't some of the issues that we've seen in economic circles around gambling and speculative investment?
Yeah, I understand the concerns, but I think the policy framework that we've got has those two outcomes at the same level, the private sector development and the human development. And I think that was a really good aspect of the policy. It does acknowledge that the economic growth isn't enough. I mean, it's enough probably for 90% of the population, but it's not for true inclusive growth. So we really need to target that, the human development side of things as well. So, and I think the policy does do that. That's certainly the intention. Yeah.
Mike? I don't know the names of every single person here. Those of you who are asking questions have been involved with EWB. Thanks, Marc.
Michael Lee, I manage remote area power for the South Australian Government. I'd like to pick up on one of the questions that Marc B raised early on. What's all this mean for EWB? And I note that you drew the distinction that EWB, I think you said uniquely, I'm not sure if that's the case, operates with volunteers. And I think that's a great strength. And then I noted Marc B's comment that really the challenges are multi, but one of them is raising the skill level from a fairly low base of in-country people. And that strikes me that that's got a time frame of a decade or three, and the time frame of volunteers is months to years, I guess. What's that mean for EWB as an organisation with that fundamental mismatch of time frames, if you like?
Can I respond to that one first? is that cheating a bit? I think, Mike, your point's really important, and that's why we've gone from what were initially fairly short-term placements to looking at almost a minimum of 12 to 18 months. But those skilled volunteers that's not an isolated capacity building activity. That volunteer then has a handover period with the next and the next. So with the majority of our partner organisations, we've got a 3, 5+ year relationship there, and very much our intention is there to be there building capacity with local counterparts and employees within that organisation over a very long period of time. in the last couple of years as well, we've started diversifying the types of partner organisations that we work with. So going back sort of 5-10 years, we were primarily focused on smaller scale community-based organisations with local leadership. Now we're saying, well, what are the key institutions within any particular region that can really strengthen the overall engineering and technical sector? So that's technical training colleges, it's universities that are delivering engineering and technical related degree programs, and it also means we're looking more and more at working with local enterprises, local engineering companies, as well as emerging professional associations as well, because all of those different types of organisations, including of course governments, make up a healthy, functioning and effective engineering community. So I think the other part of our response to your question is that we're exploring other modes of providing capacity building support. For example, professional development programs and targeted training programs for the counterparts within the organisations that we're working with, and that may or may not be provided through the long-term volunteer placement. I think there are other ways that we can provide assistance as well that we'll now start exploring.
I think that pretty much covers it. You're right, you need that long-term engagement. A 6-month stint or a 3-month stint really isn't going to do much to make change. It'll affect an individual, but it won't affect an institution, and that's really what we're going to start changing.
Kirsten, did you want to comment as well? Well, I might ask one final question there of our panellist. Could you share with us what you feel has been the biggest lesson from within the infrastructure and community development communities about how we can improve social outcomes through infrastructure work? The biggest lesson probably in the last sort of 10 years.
I think for DFAT and AUSAID prior is that we can't just rely on the safeguard systems of our partners that we work with. And this was brought out particularly by the Cambodian Railway project. But I think we need to, it all comes down to the Australian, working in the Australian context. Our accountability mechanisms are very different. You know, Parliament will hold us to account very quickly, whereas the development banks don't get that pressure quite as quickly. So they can tend to sort of ride out the storm a bit better, I guess. So I think we need to be very aware of whatever we do in the aid program, we'll be held to account pretty quickly. So we need to make sure our house is in order all the time and not rely solely on others to do the work for us.
Kirsten, would you like to comment?
I think the biggest lesson I've probably learned is that it's hard work. I mean, that's probably not very inspiring for anybody.
I think a lot of us would probably agree, though.
The rewards are good, though.
Oh, look, and I think that's exactly right. I think you have to have a very clear focus on the ultimate outcome. From a personal perspective, what do you think your contribution is going to be, and to be very clear on that. And actually that applies to every project. You should have a very clear kind of goal or objective, and that should be the driver that guides all the decision making around the project. But yes, I think that it's really difficult. It's not just about the work that I do when I'm at the coalface and I'm actually working, on the ground in Indonesia, or I'm in Tichikala in the Northern Territory. Actually, everything I do every day with everybody I work with has to be done in the same way, and it's tough. It's really tough, because what we're asking, what we need to do is work outside of our comfort zones. I think and communicate in a way that's not necessarily that easy. It's much easier to fall back into the technical sort of jargon and language, from our privileged positions in that space, I guess. And yeah, you need to be really resilient, I think. So it's I guess my lessons have been very personal. in that respect. It's just that it's tough, but it's absolutely worth every single second, and I shouldn't give up. It's
I think there's three, and there are three lessons that are old lessons that just have to be constantly relearned or remembered, recalled. And one is humility, that you're always an interloper into somebody else's society and culture, and you can share knowledge and resources and skills, but the solutions are local. They have to be developed in that context to be sustainable. Otherwise, the history of development is of part of the history of development is of failed projects because they weren't sustainable. After the funder withdrew or whatever, or the NGO, changed countries or regions. Secondly, human rights do matter. Governments have signed up to, as part of being the United Nations, to protect and advance their citizens' rights, and they're both civil, political and economic and social. And these rights translate down or are applied to and have to be protected and shored up by multilateral bodies, by partner governments, by private sector and by NGOs, and they're reflected in things like safeguards that take into account the impacts of development programs, infrastructure upon the poorest. So they're the two things I'd say.
Excellent. Well, Marc, thank you for bringing our conversation to a conclusion with a focus on values and back to human rights, because I think that remembering that bringing a sense and a focus on humility into our work is absolutely critical, and I think ultimately all of us here are motivated in one way or another by I guess the gap in access to or fulfilment of human rights around the world. So I'd like to thank all three of you very much for taking the time to join us this morning for a conversation around infrastructure and improving community outcomes. All three of our panellists have actually travelled interstate to be with us this morning. Marc, Barrett, I'd actually like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the Australian Government's support for Engineers Without Borders. As Marc mentioned, we are now part of the Australian NGO Cooperation Program, which means that a significant part of our international development work is supported through DFAT funding. And in fact, this event today, in many respects, was enabled through the Development Awareness and Raising Mechanism within the Australian NGO Cooperation Program Fund. So thank you very much on that respect, and also for your personal time today in sharing the Australian Government's priorities and approach. We really appreciate having you with us. And Kirsten and Marc Purcell, thank you both as well for joining our panel and for presenting as well. I think it was very important in hearing the public sector perspective that we also heard the private sector perspective, and also looked more broadly at emerging trends across international development and poverty alleviation from the perspective of the non-government sector too. So I really appreciate the balance and the different perspectives that you've brought into the conversation this morning. It's been a pleasure having all three of you with us. Thank you.